Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Mr. John Gunnison and myself are back at it again, finally in the saddle together. This show, we just want to let everybody know that we will start to do weekly episodes again, especially leading up to the election. But also, as a reminder, while we do focus a lot on domestic U.S. politics, we will also have episodes on major foreign and world events, because that's also something that we're both very passionate about. But today's episode will focus on a couple things. We'll start out by just briefly discussing Trump's news conference that he had on August 8th, which for us is today. And then we will transition into the selection of Tim Walz as Kamala Harris's VP and running mate. So, Mr. Gunnison, I just wanted to quickly start off, aside from welcoming you back, by seeing if you had a chance to watch the 70, 80-minute press conference that Mr. former President Trump gave today.
Well, Justin, first, I just want to remark on the fact that the last time that we sat here and did one of these together, we were talking about Joe Biden retiring, and it was before he had done so. And we were talking about all the reasons that he should. And I think that a lot of our commentary was prescient. But we've missed a lot. We haven't missed it, but we've missed the opportunity to talk about it. So Kamala Harris becoming the presumptive nominee, J.D. Vance being selected as the VP on the Republican side, the Republican convention. We didn't talk about the assassination attempt on Donald Trump at all on this program. So much has happened just in the last month and a half. It's pretty remarkable. But we're talking about things that we didn't miss, but didn't get to talk about. Now we're going to talk about something that we are going to talk about, but I did miss, which was this press conference today.
Well, a lot of our commentary was spot on. We predicted, he would drop out, and also that the base would be energized and it would likely be VP Harris. But I think why it was so great that you brought up our last show is because a lot of what we said about Joe Biden applies to the press conference that I saw Donald Trump give today. Honestly, John, I just want to spend a couple minutes on it because we really did savage President Biden, rightfully so. But this was the most incoherent, unhinged, elderly press conference moment that I have really ever seen Donald Trump give. And I know that that's ridiculous. And I know what I'm going to say will sound like I'm just describing Donald Trump and the way he talks. But it was different today. One, it does look like he lost weight. So hopefully he's not sick. Hopefully he's just on Ozempic, which is a great thing. I have friends who've taken it. Whatever you need to do to get yourself healthy, we're not here to judge. But so good for Donald Trump. He lost some weight, but he looked like crap, dude. His skin was pasty and extremely pale, not that glowing orange hue.
Hey, I take offense to this as a pasty, pale-skinned gentleman.
Yes, but you're healthy.
Hair of an orange hue.
You do have an orange hue because folks who have not seen John, he's a very strawberry blonde, strawberry red hair. No, but you have rosy cheeks. You look healthy. This guy looked like an 80-something-year-old person who...
He was wan. He was pallid. He was clammy.
Use those big words that I don't know, but yes, he was wan, as the erudite folks say on this show. It wasn't only the look. Spectral, sure. Another, 3-syllable word. It was similar to the convention speech, John, where the tone, right? He sounded down and depressed, which I don't have any empathy for this guy, so good. But also what really took me, John, was he was talking very fast, like manically fast. And in addition to that, I speak Trump fluently. Everybody knows I used to work to try and get him elected in 2016, watch all this stuff. I could not understand what he was saying because his thoughts were half finished. And as somebody who can relate, sometimes I get a little scatterbrained, overexcited. This was absolutely a few standard deviations out, to the point where I do wonder if the stress and realization that he's probably going to lose this election was getting to him. So I did just want to start off with that.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a bit of desperation there. And I think we were talking in our last program together about how the Democrats needed to find a way to get back on the front foot, to be confident, aggressive, to be the ones pushing forward and get the Republicans in a defensive position. And from what you've described, it sounds as though that's being accomplished. I think around the time of the Republican convention, after the debate against Joe Biden, the Republicans really did have the front foot. They had the ball at their feet. They were pressing on goal. Democrats are playing defense. And now it's the other way around. We were talking a lot about how Biden and Trump are both old. And the supporters of Biden remaining a candidate would say, how can you call our candidate old? Because the other candidate is just as old. And there was a point that was made by Ezra Klein, which we talked about on our last program. You don't want to give an even match on this issue. You want to have an advantage. You want to have a contrast. And now that we do have a contrast that shows how old and depleted Trump actually is, because he's running against someone who's not on an even foot with him in that way, but is younger, more energetic, more coherent, we can really see the state that he's in. He's not the same person that he was 8 years ago, but he's still saying a lot of the same old things, which makes him sound tired and boring and repetitive.
Never see the picture of the crowd. The biggest crowd I've ever spoken. I've spoken to the biggest crowds. Nobody's spoken to crowds bigger than me. If you look at Martin Luther King, when he did his speech, his great speech, and you look at ours, same real estate, same everything, same number of people, if not, we had more. And they said he had 1 million people, but I had 25,000 people. But when you look at the exact same picture, and everything's the same because it was the fountains, the whole thing, all the way back to from Lincoln to Washington. And you look at it, and you look at the picture of his crowd, my crowd, we actually had more people. They said I had 25,000, and he had 1 million people. And I'm okay with it because I liked Dr. Martin Luther King. Yeah.
We're watching these campaign rallies with VP Kamala Harris and her VP nominee, Governor Tim Walz, and they're coherent, they're sharp, they're energetic, they're upbeat. And then we go back to Trump. And when we had this dynamic between Biden and Trump, Trump was the one who sounded more energetic, more vibrant. I can't say more coherent, but the words were at least coming out, not as jumbled and mashed up. So I do wonder if part of my just galling shock is due to that juxtaposition you just mentioned. But I do also just want to say, I do think there was a legitimate issue today. And I think that, as a lot of our listeners probably like to hear, that President Trump probably should drop out of the race.
Yeah, I think that what happened with Biden and Harris has opened up our paradigm, our perception of what's possible in politics. And that was something that we were talking about as well. It's something that's really exciting when you think about how, no, elections don't have to follow the exact same patterns every time. There's a lot more that you can really do. We haven't had a candidate drop out at that point in the race ever. But the only comparable example was in 1968 when Lyndon Baines Johnson announced he wouldn't seek re-election in March. So in the year of an election.
And we weren't even a twinkle in our father's eye at that point.
No. Our fathers were 7, 10 years old, 8 years old, something like that. That had only really happened that one time, was looked back on as disaster. We shall never repeat this. We've gotten so used to the patterns of elections. Seeing that it's actually possible for someone to do what Biden did is wonderful, because it helps us realize how big the world is and how many possibilities really exist. And this sense of preordained outcome, I think we're getting over. And maybe the Republicans are looking at that and saying, oh my God, we could have done this. There's a little bit of envy. They sleepwalked into renominating Trump when they had other options. They felt forced to do it. And I know, of course, the voters were the ones that did renominate Trump. But at the same time, many of these voters are probably even thinking, wait a minute, I didn't have to vote for Trump.
The politicians, though, John, are to blame as well. It was like their support for Trump was akin to somebody enabling a drug addict instead of trying to do everything they can to get that person to seek help, the drug addict being, in this instance, the Republican Party. So let's shift a little bit. This is completely related to what we're discussing. I think that Trump was in this manic state of fear, utter existential crisis that we saw. It was a hastily called press conference because he is seeing the polling that everybody else is seeing. That it, at worst, right now, it's a toss-up. At best, it's a race that VP Harris is starting to pull ahead in. And I am certain that the internal polling that they are seeing is much, much more dire, specifically in swing states. You could probably assume swing states across the board. But the meat and potatoes of our discussion today is the decision by VP Harris to pick Tim Walz, what that will do to the race, what it has done to the race to this point, and the attacks that the GOP will levy or attempt to levy on both her and him. So just to get into this, we all have our preferences. I'm not saying you had a strong preference one way or the other, but who did you want to be the VP pick? And if it wasn't Tim Walz, who was it?
Well, I think you're right that I didn't have too strong of a preference. I liked hearing the list of names. I think it was exciting because we were getting fresh blood on the ticket at a time when we had not yet been expecting that we would. And I think it was nice to see the Democrats show off the talent that they have, especially of candidates that were elected in red states, right? I think, except for Walz and Shapiro, most of the candidates that were being considered were candidates that had won election in what are thought of as red states. So Andy Beshear, Kentucky, Roy Cooper, North Carolina, Pete Buttigieg, Indiana, and Mark Kelly, Arizona.
We hit the big boy summer there alive for a little bit. So Mr. Yes. Pritzker's from Illinois.
Yeah, big boy summer, for any listeners who are not dedicated enough, is Justin's reference to his favorite governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker. He should be your favorite governor of Illinois because of the poor record of Illinois governors that we have had.
That is fair. He's also probably my favorite governor, period.
Oh, fantastic. But anyway, it was nice seeing all of the talent that Democrats have in these states that I thought of as being red states or swing states, and seeing them all go out and audition on television, giving these interviews. We were thinking, how come we haven't seen these surrogates before? Where were they when Biden was the candidate? How come these people weren't out making the message for Biden? It was lovely to see them all. And when the list was first sort of put out there, I looked at lots of names. I said, these people all seem wonderful. Mark Kelly is someone I've long admired. I think that his personal biography is incredible. It's amazing. I remember watching the sort of news clips and videos about his support for his wife, Gabby Giffords, after she was nearly assassinated, and getting teary-eyed because it is a truly beautiful story. Roy Cooper, we were talking before about how it would be wonderful to see North Carolina really competitive again. So lots of these candidates seem fantastic. And then it did come down to what I think we both understood were the final two, which was Tim Walz and Josh Shapiro. Those are the people we're going to talk about today. I think there were advantages to either. And I think that the choice that she made was the safest choice. It was the choice that would keep the party unified. And I think that that's really the guiding light right now.
So even if it is a coin flip, you had to still have somewhat of a preference stronger for anybody. You could say Roy Cooper, Beshear, and anybody that wasn't even named. But keep it realistic. Give us a name.
Look, I'm enjoying being non-committal here. What's your answer to this question?
Tim Walz. And I tweeted it July 28th. I saw him go on Jake Tapper's show, and Jake Tapper, and we'll get into this, maybe not Jake Tapper specifically, but I saw him go on the show, and Jake Tapper was reading off a list of progressive policies that Tim Walz had been in favor of, one of them being free meals for school-aged lunch children who are attending school. And Tim Walz's response, he gave a facial expression, which you folks don't see us on video just yet, but it was similar to something I would give. It was very expressive with his eyes. And he goes, "Oh, Jake, shoot me. I wanted to feed hungry school children." And I'm like, okay, this is the type of progressive that we need. My problem isn't necessarily with all progressive policies. It's the messengers are so sanctimonious and self-serious that they need to describe these things at a logical level. And this guy's like, basically, F it, I'm doing the right thing. And he's delivering it in a funny, passionate, clear, consistent, and strong way. And
Yeah.
I saw that clip. I saw a few interviews of him. I didn't really know him that well. But immediately, even though I was holding out hope for our big boy summer, I really liked Tim Walz, so he was my choice, Sean. What do you think of the rollout so far, I guess?
So they knew they needed a strong communicator, right? What was the problem with Biden? It wasn't what he had or hadn't achieved as president. I think the Democratic Party really admired the job that he had done as president, but he couldn't communicate effectively in a campaign environment. I think we all agree about that. I don't know anyone who would disagree about that. So what they wanted to do was bring in someone who could communicate. Harris, there's been questions in the past about her skill at communicating in a political environment, not in general. She's excellent in a sort of debate forum or prosecutorial environment, you could say, to be obvious. But I think in a political environment, Harris hasn't always been the strongest performer, stronger than Biden and today's version of Trump.
And when you're saying political, she gives a hell of a stump speech. You mean town halls, you mean sitting down with an interview, kind of that back and forth, right?
Yeah, I mean, her stump speeches haven't always been fantastic, but they've been looking pretty good so far. Media interviews have been something that's been difficult for her in the past. We have an excellent podcast about this that we continue to recommend with Asted Herndon of the New York Times. So the communicators, right? So Tim Walz, he was auditioning for this job on cable television. He did a great job. Josh Shapiro, when you see him on the stump, he's clearly quite skilled. A lot of people are noticing the similarities of the way he delivers to Barack Obama, which is surely no coincidence. He studied the tape, so to speak. Pete Buttigieg, also an exceptionally talented communicator, but I think it was highly unlikely that she was ever going to choose someone else who was in the administration. So those were really, I think, the best in show when it comes to that talent. I think that Bashir and Kelly and Cooper and some of the other contenders were not necessarily as strong at communicating to the voters on television, at rallies. And so that's why the finalists ended up being Walz and Shapiro.
Yes, I agree. And it's hard to throw stones at Josh Shapiro because he is an excellent communicator. This is all subjective, what I'm going to say next. I think that to balance the ticket, it was better to have somebody that would be perceived as more approachable to your normal voters, like a Tim Walz, because while he is a great communicator, while he speaks clearly and crisply, it doesn't come off as being a Yale or Harvard educated person who studied former President Barack Obama and delivers the speeches in the same way, which can come across like Gavin Newsom, right? If you're not Barack Obama, maybe you'll come across as being too slick by half. So while I think Josh Shapiro is a 99 out of 100, I think with the communication style that Walz brings, he's more approachable. And that is to say nothing of how he looks. It's just his talking style is normal. So I do think that kind of gave him a leg up. And I think now getting into his appearance, there was another reason why she should have, or why I wanted her to select him, is because he looks like somebody in Minnesota who's going to play the mall Santa Claus and vote for MAGA after he takes off the costume, right? He looks like your traditional flyover state farmer. He looks like your blue collar worker. He kind of in a lot of ways almost resembles, I don't want to say it in a pejorative, but like Bernie Sanders, right? He's not super manicured. He's not like super coiffed with the hair that he does have left. And it's just more like your normal blue collar guy. And I think that when you're combining it with a ticket of somebody who is the sitting VP, who comes from San Francisco, which is a trope for the Republicans, right? She was San Francisco DA, I believe. They will try and attack the ticket as being this coastal elite liberal establishment ticket, but the attack just doesn't land if you have somebody on that ticket who looks like the voters that you are trying to persuade.
Yeah, I think that this is an interesting question, and I hope we get a little bit of time to talk about this. Who are the voters that they're trying to persuade, and what is the choice of Walz and the choice of Vance, frankly, say about that? So you mentioned that Walz looks like a flyover state guy. Of course, we know that he represents, as governor, a flyover state, Minnesota, Well, he was raised in an even more flyover state, Nebraska, right in the middle of the country geographically, the ultimate flyover state, along with, your Kansases and Dakotas and Oklahomas.
Don't forget about Kansas, John.
I think that Nebraska, how far would you have to travel to see a body of water of any kind, let alone the ocean? River, obviously not too far away. But anyway, it is the ultimate flyover state in many ways. I think that the selection of Walz shows the romanticization in politics of rural America and rural life. So there was a commentator on CNN, I think it was Kate Bolden, but I can't say exactly who it was, who said, when I hear Shapiro, I'm someone from the suburbs. I'm from the Philadelphia suburbs. Not me, John, her. I'm kind of paraphrasing her. And she says, he is such a familiar person to me. He's a suburban person. He's from the Philly suburbs. And people who are from that part of America know people just like Josh Shapiro. He's a familiar person to them. Walz gives off a very different cultural energy. He gives off the essence of rural America in our stereotypes. And some of these stereotypes are loaded stereotypes. When we say Shapiro doesn't seem like someone from the heartland, I mean, a lot of people might interpret that as being kind of an ugly trope, right? And I think that the way that rural America is kind of perceived in this political context, it gets a little bit nutty. So there's this romanticization of rural America, and both campaigns are clearly chasing after this mythic rural America. The Republicans choosing Vance and the Democrats choosing Walz both show how much they would love to be able to speak to rural America, because both of these two choices are perceived as being people who can do that. And I think that there has been, and Vance has contributed to this with his book, Hillbilly Elegy, this idea that rural America are the forgotten people, the true salt of the earth types who are completely ignored in our politics. But is that really the truth? In a way, it's the most pandered to part of America. It's the most romanticized part of America. And they're overrepresented in the U.S. Senate, as we know, because of the Great Plains states getting 2 senators despite their small population. The tropes that we associate with them are largely, frankly, positive. And both campaigns, just like we're saying, have picked someone to try to chase after these voters. But the suburban vote, the vote that maybe Shapiro was a little bit more tuned into, is probably what is going to decide this election. And maybe chasing after the myth of the rural voter is misguided. I mean, it's an interesting thing to talk about.
As you were describing the energy, that the differences in energy and maybe differences in appeal to a Josh Shapiro, who again, maybe is more to the suburban voters, and a Tim Walz, who is more to the quote unquote rural voters, an image came into my head in that Tim Walz, who Kamala Harris calls coach, really does remind me of a lot of the coaches that I had both growing up, playing in college. And what do I mean by that? I mean, it's their demeanor, right? It's not the overly manicured, practiced type of delivery. It is the gruff, blue collar, alpha male almost type of approach to things. And I think that as you're describing the differences, I think that honestly, maybe rural, when folks are talking about these rural voters, both Democrats and Republicans, can also be replaced with blue collar, working class white men. These voters have basically flown away from the Democratic Party. They are in some cases, the Bernie Sanders to Trump voters, the Obama to Trump voters. So I do wonder if, in a way, that the term rural is more similar to suburban women, which, as we all know, means upper middle class white women, that rural just means working class white guy.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I want to say something about this coach thing, which I think is kind of interesting. So the coach isn't just an alpha male. The coach is nurturing, right? The coach is a mentor. He's a confidant. He's a surrogate father figure. You know what I mean? The coach isn't hard. He's soft. He's non-threatening. You know what I mean? There's something about a coach which is comfortable. And I think that's exactly what they're going for with Walz, someone who's a friendly sort of almost Santa Claus sort of figure, the way that they're trying to depict him. I do agree with what you're saying about how we're using rural as a substitute for an image of a stereotypical person rather than the real population of rural people in the country.
Geographical indicator, right?
We're talking about males. We're talking about white people. We're often talking about middle-aged people. But there are people who are young. There's women who live in rural areas, of course. In the South, there are lots of Black people that live in rural areas. In the Southwest, especially, there is Spanish speakers who live in rural areas.
A lot of Black and brown rural farmers, even.
Yeah. But I think throughout American history, we have romanticized the idea of rural, right? So Thomas Jefferson, the third president, author of the Declaration of Independence, we all know him. He famously thought that the aspirational American life was the yeoman farmer, that the epitome or the quintessential American was a yeoman farmer, a small farmer with his own land, making it on his own on the frontier. And think about what is the sort of ultimate American trope in visual entertainment media. It's the Western, right? That's where we've gotten a lot of these misguided ideas about guns and vigilantism and all of that, because of how much we've built up this fictional concept of what the Wild West was like in the late 19th century. It wasn't really like that, but we've built this sort of fantasy about what it means to be rural. And I think it's fascinating that both parties are chasing after the rural voters with their choices. J.D. Vance is such an interesting character in this whole conversation because he wrote the book Hillbilly Elegy, which has helped develop the contemporary idea of who the rural voter is today. It was one of the real landmark books of American political discourse of the 2010s. And a lot of our ideas about how the country works come out of some of the things that he was tapping into there. The idea that these white people in the middle of the country are completely forgotten and pushed down by Washington and coastal elites. It's not exactly true, but it's something that's believed to the extent that both parties really want to win these kind of voters over. I think Democrats think we should win the rural vote. Remember What's the Matter with Kansas? There's an idea out there that their policies are the ones that are actually better for rural voters, and they just need to convince them of that. Once they see what we're really offering, once we have a communicator who can speak to them in their language, they'll see that we're the ones for them. And that's the voter that people really want to win. And they've demonstrated that in their choices of VP candidates.
Let's talk about how the decision not made, the road not taken. Josh Shapiro, a guy that has approval ratings in the 60s in Pennsylvania, the must-win state for both campaigns, and also the one who was considered the front runner for a very long time. But then there was a backlash. And we heard backlash. It was a very public campaign against Josh Shapiro and a really ugly whisper campaign against Josh Shapiro.
Let's move slightly from the theory and the ideals that we're talking about into the realpolitik. So it did come down, based on our understanding of everything, to Shapiro and Walz. And from my perspective, the largest faction of pundit that was supporting Shapiro were your never Trump Republicans or your former Republicans or your centrist Democrats, even maybe your like Carville types. But I'm thinking Bulwark guys and everything of the sort. I'm thinking Jonathan Chait and a lot of other writers, even Nate Silver, who kind of views himself as heterodox, but he's clearly center left. They were all pushing that Shapiro needs to be picked because he'll help moderate the ticket. But really the main reason is because adding him to the ticket gives VP Harris a leg up in Pennsylvania. And I take massive contention to this viewpoint. I think that pundits that are approaching it as fait accompli, that adding Shapiro to the ticket would have helped out and increased the tickets numbers in Pennsylvania either are using a pretextual argument because they support this person and their policies, or they're not thinking about it as deeply as they should. And the perspective that I bring is just remembering from June forward in the 2016 campaign, every single day we would be on conference calls with the campaign manager for Trump. And part of those, whether it be, convicted felon Paul Manafort, Corey Lewandowski, whether it be Kellyanne Conway, there was a rotating cast of people. They would go through the day's schedule. What was interesting to me and eye-opening, I think I was 28 at the time, so a young lad, was just the amount of fundraising and travel that the VP nominee has to do. They have to do the same amount as the president, just typically in different states. Sometimes they'll give a stump speech in the same state. But what was fascinating is Trump and Pence, for example, they would wake up in New York. They'd fly across country to California to go to a big dollar fundraiser. Then they'd fly somewhere in the middle of the country, do a rally in Wisconsin, for example. Then they go back to New York to do another fundraiser. That was one day. So that is to say that the VP's focus, the nominee's focus, is fundraising, and then also first and foremost getting out on the stump speech and going to these 7 swing states, right? Or 6 swing states, depending on how the campaign views the ticket. So if you understand that that is the role and responsibility of this candidate or of this nominee, then inherently they are not going to be spending all of their time in Pennsylvania. That is a problem, because if you don't nominate Josh Shapiro, John, he's going to be in Pennsylvania practically every day for the rest of the campaign. He's going to be out there advocating as a surrogate. He's going to be out there in the grassroots campaigns. He's going to be out there talking to grass tops influencers, which for folks is the, I guess you could say, the highest rank of local activist who is responsible for going out and signing up voters, for going out and organizing groups of people to go and knock doors, to do word of mouth marketing. But also, he's still governor of the state. So he needs to be in the state doing his job. And if he were to be the nominee, it would open him up to attacks, maybe illegitimate, maybe legitimate. I don't know, that he was putting his personal political ambitions over the people of Pennsylvania by ignoring doing the job of governor. So that is all to say, I think Josh Shapiro is actually a more effective surrogate and more effective at bringing home votes in Pennsylvania by remaining the sitting governor as opposed to being on top of the ticket because of everything I just mentioned.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about Shapiro's current position as governor, because all 3 of these target states in the Midwest, the Great Lakes states that are very competitive, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, they all have Democratic governors. And I remember after the 2020 election and the way that Trump's campaign tried to subvert the results of the election and wanted states to send alternate states of electors and say, even though Biden got the most votes in our states, we're still going to give our electoral votes to Trump, all of this stuff. It is significant that in the most important states, the Democrats have the governor's office, which, the rules for how electoral votes are assigned differ state by state, but the governor is a significant figure in the politics of all of these states. And then Georgia, of course, we know about the role that the governor played and that the Secretary of State played. And those remain Republicans, but they're ones that have proven their trustworthiness on this issue. I think that the point you make about Shapiro being able to stay in state and be an effective surrogate for Harris in the state is a good point. I think that you put your finger on a lot of the logic behind Shapiro as the selection. So you characterized the never Trump Republicans who were going to vote for Harris and centrists and all of this, who were the ones that were advocating most strongly on social media for him to be chosen. You mentioned Nate Silver. I think he's a good case because what I think it was the ultra pragmatists, right? The idea that this choice of your vice president is just going to give you a little boost in the election. That's what matters. The most important thing right now is just to win the election. You can get 1% edge in this state. That's the most important state. So you'll take that little bet and run with it. And I think it is such a sort of Nate Silver way of looking at things, because we know Nate Silver is a professional gambler, a very talented one. And for him, that's the whole ball game. It all happens in numbers, and it all happens in simulations and trials and things like this. You're rolling these dice, and you know you're going to have a slightly better chance for the dice to fall this way if you make this adjustment. Then you take that adjustment. And in the world of simulation, in the world of modeling and all of that, it makes perfect sense. But that isn't what the world of politics really is. And I don't mean that to criticize Silver. I think he gets a lot of unfair criticism. But I think that the human element is something that we should not forget about. This is the same in sports gambling too. Team chemistry matters just as much as modeling, right? And so if Harris thinks that she's going to have a smoother dynamic on her team during the campaign by choosing Walz because there's better chemistry there, if she wants Walz as a governing partner for the 4 years that come after winning the election, that's a consideration that should have, honestly, in an ideal world, more weight than this thing about, can we get a tiny little boost for that for the election? You don't necessarily want to make decisions that way when we're talking about people who are going to fill the administration of the most powerful country in the world.
I will say, from all my reading and experience, it's not accepted widely as a theory that adding somebody to a ticket from a state will give a boost to that state. I will say, though, like you just mentioned, John, I deeply respect Nate Silver. I myself am an avid sports gambler. Sports gambling is something that's only a problem if you lose. I'm not winning as much money as Chasen Buttigieg, who it was a recent disclosure for folks not in the know, that he disclosed that he won $6,800 at MGM National Harbor, the casino that's right by my house. And it came out, I guess, that Walz and Shapiro are actually friends, like close friends, in that they went to a Bruce Springsteen concert in New Jersey together. So my entire focus is winning this election because I am petrified of Trump winning. So the way that I took it was, I am an ultra pragmatist. And my view was, if the Harris campaign says this will give us 0.5% in Pennsylvania, you got to do it. I don't know how much we can trust this, John, but it was leaked out that internal polling from the Harris camp showed that there was no discernible bump in Pennsylvania from selecting Shapiro. So
it's funny that you mentioned their prior friendship between Walz and Shapiro. We heard that about a lot of the people that Harris was considering too. She knew a lot of them from her various positions. Cooper, in particular, as state attorneys general, when she was the state attorney general of California. I think Cooper in particular, she had a close relationship with. And the only one that she didn't really know prior to this vetting process was Walz. He was the only one that she had not really met and didn't have much of a relationship with. But as it was reported, at least, they had the best chemistry during the interview process, which is kind of funny. She knew the others previously. But, to your point about gaming the electoral system by picking the Veep, it doesn't always work out. We've seen examples where it certainly hasn't. Sarah Palin was certainly chosen because McCain thought that he could get some women voters who voted for Hillary Clinton in the primary against Obama and might want to defect away from the Democratic ticket in the general election.
The hockey moms.
The hockey moms. John Edwards was chosen in part because John Kerry wanted to make southern states competitive. That didn't happen at all. Maybe Florida, that was already competitive, but Edwards' home state of North Carolina didn't end up becoming competitive in that election. Dick Cheney, he wasn't chosen because Bush wanted to flip a particular state or demo. Joe Biden wasn't chosen for that reason. Mike Pence was chosen probably to help get evangelicals back on side with Donald Trump after a difficult primary with evangelicals. But look at what happened when they were governing partners, right? So gaming the system that way, it doesn't always work out.
Just to agree with you, I think that Biden was selected because he was an old white guy, and it would be less jarring to the white American public to vote for Barack Obama if Biden was on the ticket, which is not disagreeing with anything you're saying. You're saying a selection for a specific state or a very targeted demo group. It's actually Biden's kind of more similar to Walz in that regard. Yeah,
I was going to say that too. I think Biden is like Walz in that way, where it's just about the contrast and balancing the ticket. And that's part of what we were talking about, how, I'm urban, I'm from a city, San Francisco, Harris, and I'm going to pick someone from a rural area, provide that balance, whereas Shapiro is maybe a little bit more similar to me demographically. It's about balancing. It's less about I'm trying to
attorneys, right?
Yeah, target a micro demographic group in that kind of way.
In one instance where maybe there was partially a selection to flip a state was Romney selecting Ryan, and that didn't work. I think they lost Wisconsin by 4.
That, so, in hindsight, is a completely mind-boggling choice of a vice presidential running mate. It opened up, I think, Romney's biggest weakness, which was that he wasn't solid on entitlement programs that were really popular. He brought in a guy whose entire political persona was his interest in cutting those programs. So it was not a smart choice.
Cutting those programs. No, good point. Let's. I did want to just mention this. We have to mention it. So there is a strain of anti-Semitism in the far extreme wings of the Democratic Party. There were nasty anti-Semitic attacks against Shapiro, to the point where they were bringing up his history on the issue with Israel and attacking him for it singularly. I just want to mention that this is a small faction of the Democratic Party. It is the extreme wing. It is no way in mainstream. And additionally, I think we can say that these were anti-Semitic attacks because folks like Mark Kelly and Tim Walz did not suffer the same attacks, yet Tim Walz, for example, met with Netanyahu alone, has a picture of Netanyahu, condemned college protests, has a strong support for Israel. And Mark Kelly, there's a lot of similar things that we can mention. But also, I think that the GOP is blowing this way out of proportion. Don't you?
Yeah, I've been saying for years that my theory of this line of attack is that it's inspired by what happened in the United Kingdom. So for anyone who doesn't know, the Labour Party, which is the center-left party of the United Kingdom in the mid-2010s, were led by a gentleman named Jeremy Corbyn, member of parliament from Islington North. And he had made anti-Semitic comments throughout his career. He had demonstrated a kind of conspiratorial mindset about Jewish people and Israel. He had put up pictures on social media of ugly cartoons with stereotypical Jewish bankers, drawings of Jewish bankers. He had backed the mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, when he had made anti-Semitic comments. He had praised groups like Hamas and Hezbollah as members of, a strong resistance. So this became a huge political issue in the United Kingdom. It helped the Tory party, the center-right party, beat him soundly in the 2019 general election. And it caused a huge crisis inside the Labour Party that led to a lot of discontent and fissures in the party, members of the party who had been stalwarts for decades being expelled from the party, studies and reports that were done by outside experts to examine the extent of the problem, huge soul-searching process for the Labour Party. And I think that consultants and political leaders on the Republican side were watching this. I think people in DC who are political campaign professionals do pay attention to elections abroad. I know that, the average base voter isn't watching what happens in UK politics, but I think these DC consultants, a lot of whom go on to work and consult for elections in the UK, like Jim Messina and David Axelrod, they're paying attention to this stuff.
And the same thing is happening on the right side too. The consultants are going out there and consulting on these races.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Jim Messina, the one I mentioned, he was Obama's campaign manager. He actually worked for the Conservative Party in the UK when he worked on their elections. So anyway, I think that the Republican people in Washington who work on campaigns saw all this happen in the UK and say, let's make that happen here. Let's try to replicate that whole process and paint the Democrats as anti-Semitic in the way that the conservatives were able to do based on fact in the United Kingdom. But the difference is pretty simple. The leadership of the Labour Party at the time in the UK were legitimately anti-Semitic, and the leaders of the Democratic Party in the United States are not. I mean, can you find Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Kamala Harris saying anti-Semitic things?
Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer.
Yeah, Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer.
Progressive Leader Bernie Sanders.
Yes, and for decades, the majority of Jewish voters in the United States have supported the Democratic Party. There are far, far more elected officials who are Jewish on the Democratic Party than there are in the Republican Party. The Democrats have nominated a Jewish person on a presidential ticket, Joe Lieberman in 2000. The Republicans have never done that. I can't even think of a Jewish candidate who's running a primary on the GOP side for president. I can't think of anybody. I think the line of attack doesn't have that much substance, and I can see how it is clearly being influenced by the observation of events abroad. So I know that they're going to try it, but I don't think it's going to have as much success. And, we can have a whole conversation about the anti-Jewish prejudice that exists on the Republican side and on the extreme right. And I think it's more closely entwined with the leadership of the party on the Republican side than it is on the Democratic side. Donald Trump is trying to host fundraisers with Candace Owens, a Holocaust denier. He's having dinner with Kanye West and Nick Fuentes, Holocaust deniers. There's a long record of Donald Trump himself saying prejudiced things about Jewish people going back decades. So if you are going to look at a party's leadership for criticism in this vein, I would certainly focus my attention on Donald Trump.
Yes. And I think it was just important that we address that because those attacks were disgusting. And a lot of them were propagated, actually, it came out by the Trump campaign because they didn't want Shapiro to be picked because they have the conventional wisdom that Shapiro would give a bump in Pennsylvania.
Well, let's also just be very, very clear about something. The only reason that there was any basis for this attack was because Shapiro was one of the two finalists to be on the Democratic ticket, right? It's essentially an attack on the Democrats for considering him to the level that he became the second choice for this job. Who was the second choice on the Republican side for VP? I don't know who it was, but I don't think it was a Jewish American.
We don't know. Reports would suggest potentially Marco Rubio.
If he was the runner-up and they didn't choose him, does that, Justin, suggest that the Republicans are irredeemably prejudiced against Cuban Americans?
Not Cuban Americans, but I think the argument could be made against Hispanic Americans based on Trump's rhetoric. But yes, yeah, I know what you're saying.
I'm trying to make a comparison between the
I know what you're saying.
and Rubio we're in. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. The way Justin's mind worked is we were going that way, and just a big picture of a big wall came up in my mind, and Trump coming down that golden escalator, and I'm like, well, John, be careful where you're going here. No, I agree. I just wanted to touch on one more thing, one more benefit of picking Walz as the VP that I honestly just realized last night in a way, seeing these protesters interrupt VP Harris, these pro-Palestine protesters who are rightfully enraged about the atrocities that are happening in the Gaza Strip. I truly believe that these people believe in what they are protesting. I think it's contemptible about the way they are going about it, because if it has any impact, the impact is going to be in re-electing former President Donald Trump. So it kind of cuts against their ultimate goal, which is to bring stability to the Middle East and an end to this conflict. But as this was happening and I saw VP Harris's response, it's important to note for everybody that she met with the leaders of the uncommitted vote before the rally that she gave. She spoke to them. She agreed to have staff and maybe even herself meet with these folks behind closed doors. One of the leaders of the uncommitted vote, who was out there protesting against Biden, endorsed her hours before this event. And then their supporters came in and disrupted the discussion and rally that she was having. And I think Kamala Harris handled it beautifully with both class and strength and understanding, but also a no BS type of attitude in a dignified way. This was a huge issue, John. Israel-Palestine was a huge issue among pundits. Obviously, it's still a huge issue among global affairs and all of the suffering that we are witnessing. But when I say huge issue, I mean we had the college campus protests set up with a spate of bad polling for President Biden, specifically in two core Democrat tent groups, progressive and young voters. And as all of this was happening, this polling was coming out, cable news pundits, they have shows every day for like 12 or 14 hours a day. They need to discuss things. I think what was happening is a lot of different things were getting conflated. And the issue of Israel-Palestine was getting more attention and more emphasis on the impact that it would have on the election due to the aforementioned polling, due to the groups that were the most vocal protesters being young progressives. You had pundits who are connecting a decline in polling for Biden among these groups with the issue at hand. And John, as you know, my view on foreign policy typically is, unless American troops are directly involved, it's typically for your overwhelming majority, I'm talking over 90% of voters, if they're not personally affected by the issue or have friends and family affected by the issue, they are not going to make that their number one voting issue.
Not even always when there are American troops involved, right? The war in Afghanistan was a very low salience political issue, unfortunately, for a long time. Not every American involved conflict is Iraq or Vietnam that has the level of political salience that those conflicts had. We've seen situations where American troops were involved in a large-scale, long-term conflict, and it was not even being discussed on the debate stage during presidential elections, which I think is shameful. But if there is a conflict that U.S. troops are not involved in that people care about, it does tend to be this one. But I think we probably do agree that the number of people that prioritize the issue is not as high as the number of young voters who were otherwise dissatisfied with Biden.
Yes. So all of this is happening at once, right? Because you had establishment media, establishment Democrats. Hell, John, even I was telling you it's too late for Biden to drop out. You had the wagon circled around Biden. So the only energy in the party to oppose him was coming from this conflict and an opposition to how he was handling the conflict. So what I think happened was a lot of progressive and young voters who were being polled about this issue, a lot of progressive and young voters who were getting worked up and voting uncommitted about this issue. A lot of them who were making noise were doing so more so because of their opposition to Biden, who, despite his very progressive policies, they viewed as the establishment candidate who was far too old to run, did not represent them, was out of touch with their generation and their views on the world and society. So you have Biden step aside, VP Harris come in, you have a massive circling of the wagons. We haven't discussed this yet, but people leading the charge for Biden to drop out and be replaced by VP Harris were these online progressives. They were reappropriating the coconut meme. They were out there advocating for her, calling her, we need the top cop. And this is a complete 180 from what she experienced in the primary, where she was trying to virtue signal to these voters, and it was just falling flat because progressives hated her. So you do have this instance of just outright support for Harris, and then she's picked. The honeymoon period is not going to last forever because she's not really super progressive in a coding type of way to these voters. So there was always going to be a risk of the base and young voters, these progressive base, the progressive young voters, splintering off from Harris later on down the line as the Trump attacks and other attacks on her started to seep in. However, by picking VP Walz, nominee for VP Tim Walz,
getting ahead of ourselves there. Yeah.
Lord
perhaps soon to be VP Walz. Although I do think it's funny that at rallies he is now speaking at a lectern that says Vice President of the United States because it's Harris's podium. So you can already take a snapshot and see what it will look like if and when he does become VP, because he's already standing at a podium that says Vice President of the United States. Anyway, go on.
That is wonderful. I didn't even notice that. What perfect foreshadowing. So anyways, by picking VP Walz, what you have happening here, picking Walz, what you have happening here is a further circling of the wagon. So progressives got one win by getting Biden out and Harris to replace him. Now they have a second win because Walz, along with maybe Pritzker, were the two most progressive, potentially viable candidates for this nomination. So once she picked him, these progressives now have two wins under their belt, and they feel energy for the ticket, but also they feel buy-in. They feel like their voices were heard. So any reasonable young voter, any reasonable progressive that isn't focused on tearing down the party because of the Gaza-Israel issue or a number of other issues and using it as a proxy is not going to leave Harris and Walz over this ongoing conflict in the Middle East. So what I think has happened in effect is that Harris picking Walz has further marginalized these protesters who are very aggrieved in a way that quite frankly, the campaign can ignore them, because whereas you maybe had tens of thousands of young voters and progressives in a state like Pennsylvania who were using this issue to virtue signal their dissatisfaction with Biden and maybe wouldn't have come out, that number has been whittled way down to people who truly are one issue voters in this electorate on this issue.
So a few things about this. The first thing I want to say is I think we are sort of taking it for granted that progressives love Tim Walz. The truth is that most Americans, including most progressives, don't really know that much about him yet. We did see that when he was auditioning for vice president, progressives on the internet, very politically involved, very plugged in progressives, were loving the appearances that he was making. And there were some prominent progressives, I'm thinking of people like Mehdi Hasan, who went out and endorsed him to be vice president. But in the piece that Mehdi wrote in The Guardian, endorsing Walz as the choice, he acknowledged that he didn't even know who Walz was 2 weeks before he wrote the column. So people are playing catch up to Walz, and there's a lot of projection that's happening on him. I think that the reputation that he's got now as a progressive darling is based mostly on his record as governor of Minnesota. He put up a lot of big progressive wins, and some of those were in areas like education policy that Shapiro was not considered to be a progressive at all, because he had endorsed school voucher programs and things like that progressives abhor. Walz had put free school lunches in cafeterias and done things in that area of policy that progressives were ready to celebrate. When Walz was a member of Congress, he was not perceived as being a progressive. He was not a very high profile member of Congress. He held down a seat that he had flipped from red to blue in the 2006 wave election, and he held it down successfully by towing the line and appealing to a lot of conservative voters in that district. You know, we were looking at some examples. We were chuckling about how he had actually voted to hold Attorney General Eric Holder in contempt, aligning with the Republicans in that vote. And then Holder ended up being the one who was the leader of the committee to vet vice presidential nominees for Harris, and presumably was ready to embrace Walz at that point. So clearly he wasn't holding a grudge. But that was one example of an issue that Walz had aligned with the Republicans. He was also popular with the NRA. He had been an advocate for gun ownership. So there were, at the time that he was a member of Congress, he was not perceived as being progressive at all. But now that he's the governor and he has put up a lot of wins on the board for progressives and people are discovering him and learning about his record as governor, he has been embraced by online progressives. But that's not all of the progressives. And there's polls that show that 70% of Americans still don't know him. So we're still developing his public persona on the national stage. He's one of probably the lesser known candidates who have been put into this position, even though he does have a long record of public service. Now, something I want to say about this broader issue that you're talking about how the Democratic campaign are going to approach the war in Gaza. One thing that I do want to say, we've been complimenting a lot of decisions that the Harris camp have been making, but the Harris campaign need to put forward a policy program, and they haven't really done that yet. I think that that's an area of fair criticism so far. Now, the campaign is new, but right now it's kind of a mystery exactly what they stand for, other than what's being carried over from Biden, from her campaign in the 2019-2020 cycle, and statements that they've put out disavowing parts of her platform from that cycle. It's going to be important for someone who might become president of the United States to do some interviews, talk about these issues, and put forward a policy platform. Hopefully we'll be getting that partly at the convention. But it's important that Harris differentiate herself from the incumbent Joe Biden in areas of policy, because she is his vice president. She's in the administration, but she's going to be her own person as president. She's not just going to be a younger Biden. And this area, the war in Gaza and how the U.S. are handling it, this would be a good area for her to differentiate herself from Biden. It's a tricky thing to do because the politics of this are a landmine, but it is morally valid for her to make some differentiation here. It will hopefully appease some of the voters that were dissatisfied with Biden. I know we're talking back and forth about how many of them care about this issue, but I think it would send a strong signal to young voters in general.
I don't disagree with what you're saying. I think, just quickly harkening back, I think that you say online progressives, I'd add in progressive thought leaders are also behind Tim Walz. There's something called anchoring bias, which you know of, John. It's been shown in studies. It's a massive thing in political psychology, where it's not politics, it's just how the human mind works with information. So the studies done are, if you show somebody misinformation, and that's the first piece of information they hear on a topic, and then you wait some time and come back later with all of these stats and figures that dispel that misinformation. I'm not going to give a percentage, but the overwhelming majority of folks continue to hold on to that misinformation that they had seen first. And that's called, quote unquote, anchoring bias. So when folks are hearing people, pundits, news anchors, everybody say that there is a race to define Tim Walz between, and VP Kamala Harris for that regard, between the two campaigns, it's who can get their information out there that seems somewhat credible first. So for these online left and for these thought leaders to support Tim Walz and for the Trump campaign to attack him as a communist and socialist, the people that these progressives trust and listen to, the people that these progressives hate, they're hearing one message, that this guy is further left than normal. So I do think that he has and will continue to buttress the progressive tent, so to speak. But I your point, he's relatively unknown, is taken well, because I doubt 30% of voters even know that who he is. You know, you get a respondent to a poll, maybe they're embarrassed to say they don't know who he is. So that's point one. But point two is, I agree with everything you just said. Last night, the Harris campaign released a statement saying she was open to discuss not providing weapons from the U.S. to Israel. Today, they walk that back. Additionally, today, I'm sure you saw, this is kind of your ballywick, your expertise. Biden gave a joint statement, I want to say, with the leaders of Qatar and Egypt, and it was calling on Hamas and Israel to come to a ceasefire. So that is all to say, I don't think the VP has a plan, because it's such a thorny issue. Like you said, there are voters who care about this issue, maybe overwhelmingly more so on the side of Israel, even in the Democratic Party. So I would assume that the campaign's plan is to hope and pray that President Biden can get a ceasefire done, and that they can largely ignore the issue, and not ignore it, but approach the issue by rebuilding the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, so you put a poll out there that says, who do you support, Israel or Hamas, or even Israel or the Palestinians? And those are very different things, and that's important to note. You're going to get a lot of responses that say Israel. I think a poll recently, 60% or something like that. But if you ask people, do you support the two-state solution? If you ask people, should weapons sales and transfers be conditioned on following the laws of war? There's a lot of questions that you can ask that will give you a result that's not as straightforward. And I think a lot of Democrats who support Israel, I think a lot of Jewish Americans, I think a lot of moderates, I think whatever other category we're worried about alienating, are ready to embrace a lot of those more nuanced positions, are ready to support the two-state solution, are ready to prioritize following the laws of war. You know, this is a difficult issue, and it's a needle to thread, but it's an important issue. And the differences between blanket support on one side or the other, and all the other ways to approach this problem, are important. So I think I agree with what you're saying, Justin, in a lot of ways. The Harris campaign, they need to actually put forward a policy platform. This was a weakness of her last campaign. I hope it's not something that we see again. The best hope is that it will all be resolved before the election. But when and if and when she is president, she is going to have to face crises, and Biden isn't going to be there to make the decisions. And I do want to say something about this online versus real life thing, because, you know, we were talking about that as well, and it's interesting. So I agree with you that a lot of these thought leaders are online and they're influencers, and the decisions that are made are downstream of them, and what the body politic that's associated with those thought leaders is going to think. They're following cues from the thought leaders that are in their camp, right? And I think that the Harris campaign so far have shown that they are very much responding to social media. We were talking about the coconut memes. Perhaps their affection for Walz was influenced by the way that social media embraced Walz. And I think this campaign are very online. But you know who else are very online? The Trump campaign. And this is going to be the most online election that we have ever had.
Yeah, it's just they're online on 4chan and white nationalist websites.
Yeah. Although the difference between Twitter and some of those platforms is getting a little bit harder to distinguish.
It's smaller and smaller and smaller.
How are you going to build a water treatment plant in a town of 400 if you don't have a collective effort at it? So I have to tell you, they scream socialism. We just build roads and we build schools and we build prosperity into this. Their whole plan is to go backwards, to give tax cuts to the wealthy. And look, it was so surprising. You know, these super successful Donald Trump who inherited $400 million and then proceeded to fail at everything. Middle America, you earn it, but you know what? You're not on your own. Neighbors help neighbors. And I will, this one bothers me. I heard you talking about punching back at the bullies. They see people less fortunate as scapegoats and you know, punchlines for their jokes. We see them as neighbors. And I said it with my mom. My dad dies when my little brother's young. We're teenagers. We get Social Security survivor benefits. I'm all for pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. We didn't have any boots.
So I did just want to touch on the two attacks that I see already being used by the Trump campaign against both Harris and Walz. The first is that Walz is a communist. I'm going to read you his policies, and I'm going to give you my top line response first. I think that some of these policies are very progressive, but just because they're progressive policies does not mean that Americans are going to view them as socialist. So there are about 5 or 6 policies here. So Tim Walz provided funding, which provides free college for students with a family income under $80,000, including illegal immigrants. That last little bit is definitely problematic in some regards, especially with immigration taking center stage here. He created a state system for paid family and medical leave, capped at a combined 20 weeks a year. I think that voters are generally going to be supportive of that. Mandated that public utilities generate 80% carbon-free electricity by 2030, ramping up to 100%. He subsidized electric vehicles by requiring electric vehicle charging infrastructure. I think that the fact that Elon Musk is one of Trump's biggest supporters kind of takes away the electric vehicle attack. He passed one of the nation's most permissive abortion statutes that is essentially no limits and no age consideration for minors. Again, voters in Ohio just codified a similar law in a ballot initiative when given the choice between something over restrictive and something that would be seen as very liberal. That's not a problem. If anything, that is a plus for him. He declared Minnesota to be a trans refuge. I think that people want the government out of their fucking bedrooms. So I don't know if that's going to be such a salient attack. And more so, we saw how weird the GOP came across with their attacks on Dylan Mulvaney and Bud Light, with their attacks on Target for having rainbow clothing, right? Weird, by the way, a term that was coined by Governor Tim Walz. And then the last one here, he established automatic voter registration and let Minnesotans sign up for permanent absentee ballot option. Republicans are now embracing this shit. So of all of those, I think giving free college to children of illegal immigrants, or to illegal immigrants, actually, is maybe the most problematic. But I don't know about you. I don't see any red flags there. It certainly doesn't scream socialist or communist to me.
Well, first I want to say, Justin, you've attributed the weird line of attack against the Republicans to Governor Walz. We should also give credit to our most recent guest, Andrew Lawrence, your good friend, who played a role in popularizing that line of attack as well, as he's been given credit for doing so by several major media organizations. Friend of the show. But I just want to say about this, I think that calling a Democrat communist is sort of, for Republicans, what the way they feel about Democrats calling them racist. It's used so often and so casually that it has lost almost all of its power. I think that the Republicans feel very much that Democrats are too quick and eager to call them racist. And even if some of the attacks for them being racist are earned, a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are exaggerations or looking at a statement or an action with too much paranoia and not enough sort of benefit of the doubt, right? And that's sort of where we're at with this communist socialist thing. And I think the voters kind of know that at this point. They're so used to hearing these same bits of name calling, these same words thrown out there for nothing.
Trite tropes.
Yeah, that there's not a lot of power left in it. I think the words have been cheapened by overuse and misuse. So I think that it's not something that's compelling.
But none of those policies jumped out at you as like super out of the mainstream, right?
Not really.
I'm not saying you agree with them all.
No, I've got them in front of me, and yes, nothing here sounds like it's Trotskyite. So
when you said that, before you said that, my mind, as you were scrambling for the word, I saw a picture of a red sickle in him.
Yes. The
last thing I'd like to say is they're going to attack him for Minneapolis burning down. And it's on video where Trump is praising him as the finest governor at controlling the riots because he called in the National Guard and used overwhelming force. And Tim Walz got on the call and was extremely empathetic to the perspective of the protesters. But he also agreed, yes, Mr. President, force was needed to calm everything down. And now that everything is calmed down, we need to listen to the grievances. So if I'm the Harris-Walz campaign, I am spending $100 million, 7 swing states, just letting that, chopping that up and letting it run for 30-second commercials. Donald Trump says Tim Walz is tough on crime.
Everyone that Donald Trump has criticized, he's praised, and everyone that he's now praising, he's criticized, right? And
it's not all on tape that clearly, though.
Yeah, well, this includes governors in 2020, right, who are dealing with the pandemic and these riots. It includes Governor Newsom and Governor Cuomo of New York. It also includes Xi Jinping of China, right, who Trump later on in 2020 tried to blame for the virus. Early on during the spread of the virus, he was praising Xi for the way he had handled it. But you know who else it includes, Justin? Kamala Harris, who Trump donated to in her elections in California.
Before I give you the last word, the one thing that I remember from the press conference today vividly was a reporter asked him about Willie Brown. And Trump retells this story. He's like, oh, I know Willie Brown. We were actually flying in a helicopter one day. And at this point, he was very out on Kamala Harris. He did not like Kamala Harris. And I'm like half listening. I'm doing work. And he goes, yeah, we're flying in the helicopter. And he goes, and the helicopter almost went down. We almost crashed. And I'm like, it was just such a funny it's such a funny non sequitur hyperbolic Trump thing to say. And I'm like, I just started laughing at my desk. I'm like, that's the old Trump. That's funny.
We're talking about Trump's degeneration. We opened this conversation talking about that press conference, but you can really tell if you listen to him how much of his way of thinking is word association. And he's actually been like that for a long time. You mentioned something, a person, and his mind immediately goes to the time that he met them or an anecdote about them. This word is associated with that. He's been doing that lately with asylum seekers. He starts talking about mental asylums.
And Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah, it's word association based. And this is not usually the sign of a sharp mind. But yeah, I mean, talking about the praising and criticizing when you're on my team and you're not on my team. I mean, go back to 2020. He had a lot kinder things to say about Tim Walz than he did about JD Vance.